I still remember my first day at the office. I had walked in nervous, clutching a worn-out briefcase that once belonged to my father. It wasn't the fanciest bag, but it carried with it my determination, my dreams, and the silent prayers of my family. I had landed the job after months of rejection letters, endless interviews, and the nagging feeling that I wasn't good enough. So, stepping into that shiny corporate building felt like stepping into a different world. One where I finally had a chance to prove myself. At first, I thought everyone was welcoming. Smiles at the reception desk, polite greetings from colleagues. As I was shown to my desk, but it didn't take long before I noticed one person whose smile was different. Not warm, not kind, but mocking. His name was Daniel. Daniel was the office star. He's the kind of guy who dressed sharp, walked with confidence, and knew how to get people laughing in the break room. On the surface, he seemed charming, the kind of coworker people liked having around. But I soon discovered that charm had a cruel edge, and he had picked me as his target. It started small. The first week, he made jokes about my old briefcase, asking if I'd borrowed it from a museum. People laughed nervously, and I forced myself to smile, pretending it didn't sting. Then he mocked the way I dressed, pointing out that my shirts looked budget and my shoes seemed like they came from a thrift store. I tried to brush it off. I told myself he was just teasing, that maybe I was being too sensitive. But it didn't stop there. Daniel began to ridicule me during meetings. If I made a suggestion, he'd roll his eyes dramatically and say, "Wow, brilliant idea, if we were still living in the 90s. Everyone laughed, and I sank deeper into my chair, heat burning my cheeks. Sometimes he'd interrupt me entirely, cutting off my points with his sarcastic comments. Slowly my confidence began to crumble. I dreaded going to work. Every morning I stood in front of the mirror, forcing myself to straighten my tie, put on a brave face, and walk into that office, knowing I would be mocked again. The humiliation gnawed at me, but I didn't want to quit. I needed this job. My family needed me to succeed. So I endured it. I kept my head down, worked hard, and told myself that someday, somehow, things would change. The worst part was that Daniel wasn't just cruel, he was smart. He delivered results. Management liked him. He was the golden boy, and no one dared to call him out. To them, his teasing was just harmless banter. They didn't see the way it drained me, the way it made me doubt myself, the way it made me feel small every single day. I started spending my lunch breaks alone. While others chatted and laughed in the cafeteria, I hid at my desk, pretending I had work to finish. I couldn't bear the thought of sitting near him, waiting for his next joke at my expense. The isolation hurt almost as much as the bullying. One evening, after another humiliating day, I sat on my bed staring at the ceiling, asking myself if this was my life now. Was I destined to always be the quiet one, the punching bag, the person everyone overlooked? That thought lit a spark in me. For the first time, I admitted to myself that I didn't want to just survive in that office. I wanted to rise. I wanted to prove Daniel wrong. From that night on, I changed my mindset. Instead of drowning in self-pity, I started planning. I studied harder, stayed late in the office, and took on projects others avoided. If someone needed help with data analysis or reports, I volunteered. If there was an opportunity to learn a new skill, I grabbed it. Slowly, I started becoming the guy people could rely on. But Daniel noticed. And the more I improved, the harsher. His mocking became... When I stayed late at work, he joked, "Careful, the janitors might think you're applying for their job." When I presented well in meetings, he clapped sarcastically, saying, "Wow, look at Mr. Genius over here." He wanted me to stay in the box he had put me in, weak, insecure, insignificant. But I didn't stop. The pain he caused me became fuel. Every insult, every laugh at my expense added to my determination. I worked harder than ever. Slowly, managers started noticing. They complimented my reports, praised my ideas, and trusted me with more responsibility. For the first time, I felt like maybe I belonged. Still, Daniel remained untouchable. He was slick, smooth-talking, and knew how to charm the bosses. I couldn't outshine him overnight, but deep down, I promised myself that one day I would. That Promise became my obsession. I enrolled in evening courses to improve my management skills. I read books on leadership, communication, and strategy. While others spent their weekends partying, I spent mine building myself up, brick by brick, skill by skill. It was exhausting, but every time I thought about quitting, I remembered Daniel's laughter, his mocking voice, and I pushed harder. Months turned into years. I rose through the ranks, slowly but steadily. I became a team lead, then a supervisor. With each step up, I gained more confidence, more respect. And yet Daniel was always there, still smirking, still mocking. He couldn't accept that the guy he once humiliated was now catching up to him. What he didn't know was that I wasn't just catching up, I was preparing to surpass him. The shift didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual climb, one rung at a time, like scaling a ladder in the dark where you don't even know how far the top is, but every small victory mattered. I began to notice that colleagues who once laughed at Daniel's jokes now turned to me for guidance. If they had questions, they came to my desk. If they needed someone dependable, I was the one they trusted. Daniel hated that. I could see it in his eyes, the irritation behind his fake smile, the way his jaw tightened when my name was mentioned in meetings. He would never admit it, but he saw the tide shifting. Still, he doubled down on his antics, as if mocking me. Louder would keep me beneath him. One day during a project meeting, the manager asked for volunteers to lead a difficult client presentation. The room went silent. It was a higher-risk assignment, one that could either make or break someone's career. Daniel smirked and said, "Maybe our little overachiever here should give it a try. Let's see if he can handle more than spreadsheets." He looked at me, eyes glittering with malice, expecting me to back down, but something inside me snapped. For so long I had avoided confrontation, letting his words bury me. Not this time. I met his gaze and said, "I'll do it." The room fell silent for a second. Even the manager raised an eyebrow, as if surprised by my confidence. Daniel laughed and leaned back in his chair, muttering, "This will be fun." That presentation became a turning point. I spent sleepless nights preparing, researching every detail, rehearsing until my voice cracked. When the day came, I stood in front of the clients, my palms sweating, but my voice steady. I delivered every slide with precision, answered every question with clarity, and when it was over, the clients applauded. My manager congratulated me in front of everyone. For the first time, I didn't just survive, excelled. And Daniel couldn't hide his frustration. From then on, opportunities kept coming. I was trusted with bigger projects, given more leadership responsibilities, and each success built my reputation. But along with that success came more venom from Daniel. He whispered rumors, tried to undermine my work, even attempted to take credit for my ideas. Times it felt like a war hymn trying to drag me down, me fighting to rise above. But there was one thing he didn't understand. I had already endured the worst of his bullying. Nothing he did could hurt me the way it once had. His words had lost their power. Instead, every jab reminded me why I was fighting so hard. One evening, after a particularly long day, I stayed behind in the office, finishing reports. The floor was quiet, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound. Daniel walked past my desk and paused. "You really think you're something now, don't you?" he sneered. I looked up at him calmly and said, "No, Daniel, I don't think I'm something. I just know I'm not who I used to be." He stared at me, perhaps realizing for the first time that the timid guy he once bullied was gone. He walked away without another word. That night, I realized something important. Daniel's power over me had always been an illusion. He thrived on my fear, my silence, my willingness to accept humiliation. But now that I had grown stronger, his mockery was nothing more than noise. Still, I wasn't satisfied. I didn't just want to be free of his influence, I wanted to rise, high enough that he would have no choice but to respect me, so I pushed harder. I applied for internal promotions, volunteered to lead cross-departmental projects, and built networks outside the company. I learned how to speak confidently in front of executives, how to negotiate deals, how to inspire people instead of just managing them. Slowly, my career trajectory began to outpace Daniel's. He had grown comfortable, relying on charm and shortcuts, while I had built a foundation of discipline, resilience, and skill. People saw the difference. Managers started inviting me to strategy meetings where Daniel wasn't even considered. My name appeared in performance reviews and company memos. In discussions about the future of the organization, the more I rose, the more isolated Daniel became. Colleagues who once laughed at his jokes now rolled their eyes. The friends who once admired his charisma drifted away. Without an audience, his cruelty seemed hollow. But life has a strange way of turning the tables when you least expect it. One morning, an email arrived announcing that a senior manager was leaving the company. The position was open. It was a major role, one that came with authority, influence, and responsibility over multiple teams. Immediately, I felt a spark inside me. This was the opportunity I had been waiting for. I applied without hesitation. The process was grueling round after round of interviews, presentations, and assessments. But I gave it everything I had. Every late night, every book I had read, every ounce of experience I had gained, it all came into play. When the announcement finally came, I could hardly believe it. My name was in bold letters, promoted to senior manager. I had done it. I walked into the office the next day, feeling different. My title wasn't just a word on paper, it was validation. Proof that all the pain, all the struggle had led to this. My new office was larger, with a glass wall overlooking the city. But what struck me most wasn't the view, it was the knowledge that I now had authority over the very team where Daniel worked. The office bully, the man who had mocked me for years, was now reporting to me. The irony was almost too much to process. The same person who once reduced me to silence in meetings would now have to listen when I spoke. The same person who made me feel small would now stand before me as his manager, and when I first saw the look on his face during that introduction meeting, I knew the tables had finally turned. But the story wasn't over, because it was being his manager. Didn't just give me power, it gave me a choice. The first team meeting after my promotion was one I will never forget. Everyone gathered in the conference room, the atmosphere buzzing with curiosity. Some looked excited for me, others cautious. But all eyes eventually turned toward Daniel. He sat in his usual spot, arms crossed, a forced smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. I stood at the front of the room, straightened my notes, and took a slow breath. "Good morning, everyone," I began, steady and calm. "As you know, I'll be stepping into the role of senior manager. Want us to focus on collaboration, growth, and respect." My words weren't just for the team, they were for him. Respect, a word he had denied me for years. As the meeting continued, I noticed Daniel shifting in his seat. He avoided eye contact, his usual sarcastic remarks absent. For once, he wasn't in control. The room no longer revolved around his jokes, revolved around my leadership. Still, I knew this wouldn't be easy. Daniel wasn't the type to bow his head quietly. He would test me, challenge me, and look for cracks in my armor. And I had to be ready. Sure enough, the tests began almost immediately. When I assigned tasks, he dragged his feet. When I asked for updates, he gave vague answers. He spoke to me with thinly veiled condescension, as though refusing to accept the new reality. Part of me wanted to snap back to humiliate him the way he had humiliated me. It would have been so easy to throw his own tactics in his face, to relish in the reversal of power. But I held back, because I realized something. True revenge wasn't about becoming like him. It was about showing him what real leadership looked like. So instead of mocking him, I set clear expectations. Instead of belittling him, I gave him opportunities to prove himself. Every time he tried to provoke me, I responded with professionalism. It wasn't easy. I had to swallow my pride more than once, but I reminded myself of the long game. Over time, the dynamic began to shift. The team noticed how I handled him. They saw that I wasn't driven by ego or spite, but by fairness. Slowly, they began to respect me not just as their manager, but as their leader. One afternoon, I called Daniel into my office. He walked in with that familiar smirk, though it didn't reach his eyes anymore. "Close the door," said. He raised an eyebrow but obeyed. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Daniel, I know you don't like working under me, I know. This isn't easy for you. Here's the reality. We're on the same team now. You can fight me, or you can work with me. The choice is yours." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he chuckled and leaned back in his chair. "I think you've won, don't you?" I didn't flinch. "This isn't about winning. It's about moving forward. You can stay stuck in the past, or you can step up and prove that you're more than just the office clown. Because if you don't, your career ends here." The smirk faded. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Certainty. He didn't answer right away, just nodded stiffly and walked out. But from that day on, things changed. Daniel wasn't suddenly a model employee, but the open hostility started to fade. He completed his tasks, participated in meetings without mocking me, and kept his remarks to himself. It was as if he finally realized the game was over. But for me, the story wasn't just about putting him in his place. It was about proving to myself that I had grown beyond the person I used to be. I wasn't the scared new hire anymore. I wasn't the silent victim. I had become someone stronger, someone capable of leading not just with authority but with dignity. And strangely enough, as time went on, I began to feel something I never expected toward Daniel - pity, because while I had been using his cruelty as fuel to grow, he had been stuck in the same cycle, clinging to his cheap jokes and shallow charm. He hadn't evolved. He hadn't prepared for the future, and now he was paying the price. Months passed. Under my leadership, the team thrived. We met deadlines, secured new clients, and even won recognition from the company's executives. I received praise, bonuses, and opportunities to speak at leadership events. Every success felt like another brick in the wall I had built between who I was and who I had become. Daniel, meanwhile, faded into the background. The spotlight that once belonged to him was gone, and he didn't know how to cope. Still came to work every day, still did his job, but he was no longer the star. He was just another employee, overshadowed by the very person he once mocked. One Friday evening, as I packed my things to leave, I saw him lingering by the elevator. For the first time in years, he didn't look smug. He looked tired. "Got a minute?" he asked. I hesitated but nodded. We stood in the empty hallway, the hum of the fluorescent lights above us. He shifted awkwardly before finally speaking. "Look, I know I was rough on you back then, maybe more than I should have been." It wasn't exactly an apology, and it was the closest thing I had ever heard from him. I looked at him, remembering all the times he had humiliated me, all the nights I had gone home questioning my worth. Part of me wanted to hold on to that anger forever, but another part of me, the part that had grown stronger, knew it was time to let go. So I simply said, "I know." He nodded, almost relieved, and stepped into the elevator without another word. As the doors closed, I realized something important. My journey hadn't just been about proving him wrong. It had been about proving myself right, proving that no matter how low someone tried to push me, I had the strength to rise. And in that moment, I knew I had won not by becoming his enemy, but by becoming everything he never thought I could be. The weeks after that awkward elevator conversation settled into a strange rhythm. Daniel wasn't my friend, not by any stretch. But the open hostility had dulled into something quieter. Showed up, did his work, and for the most part, kept his head down. I could sense the conflict inside him, that the pride that made it hard for him to fully acknowledge the change, and the realization that he no longer had the upper hand. But I didn't dwell on him. My focus was on my team, on making sure that the department I now led would become a model of efficiency and innovation. I wanted to create the kind of environment where no one would ever feel the way I had once felt. Small, isolated, and humiliated. If I had the power to change the culture, then I owed it to the younger version of myself to make sure that power was used wisely. One of the first changes implemented was open communication. I encouraged my team to share ideas freely, no matter their role. I reminded them that respect wasn't optional. It was the foundation of our success. At first, people were hesitant. Years of office politics had made them cautious, but slowly, they began to trust me. Meetings that were once dominated by a handful of voices opened up to everyone. New ideas flowed, and innovation followed. I also invested time in mentorship. I knew what it felt like to be lost, to lack confidence, to have someone undermine you. So I made sure to guide the newer employees, to give them opportunities to shine, to tell them what I had once longed to hear: you're capable, you matter here. The transformation was remarkable. Productivity soared, morale improved, and our department began to outshine others. Executives noticed. My name came up in board meetings, and suddenly I was being groomed for even bigger things. But success brought new challenges. The higher I climbed, the more eyes were on me. Expectations grew heavier, and every decision carried greater weight. There were late nights when I sat alone in my office, staring at the skyline, wondering if I was ready for the responsibility. Doubt never fully disappears, just changes its form. And then, of course, there was Daniel. Though quieter than before, he hadn't completely vanished into the background. He still had moments where his pride got the better of him. A snide remark here, a sarcastic chuckle there. But instead of anger, I felt something closer to sadness. When I saw him act that way, because I knew he was capable of more, he just didn't know how to let go of the persona he had built. One day, an opportunity arose that would test both of us. Our company was competing for a massive client contract, one that could define the next decade. The executives called me in and asked me to assemble a project team to craft the proposal. It would require creativity, strategy, and flawless execution. As I reviewed potential team members, my eyes landed on Daniel's name. My first instinct was to skip over him, to choose someone safer, easier to manage. But something inside me hesitated. If I left him out, it would be an easy victory for my pride. But if I included him, it could be a chance for something greater for him, for me, for the team. So, against my initial impulse, I put his name on the list. When I announced the team, Daniel's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he hadn't expected to be chosen. Maybe he thought I would hold a grudge. Maybe he thought I'd use this chance to sideline him. Instead, I handed him responsibility. The project was grueling. He worked long hours, debated strategies, and polished every detail of the proposal. Daniel was hesitant at first, contributing the bare minimum. But as the deadline approached, something shifted. I saw flashes of the skill that had once made him the golden boy of the office. His insights were sharp, his ideas innovative. Damned. For the first time, he delivered them without the edge of mockery. It wasn't easy for either of us. There were moments when old habits almost resurfaced, when he looked at me like the insecure new hire, and when I looked at him like the arrogant bully. But we pushed past it, slowly building a fragile form of respect when the day of the client. Presentation arrived. Our team walked into the boardroom with confidence. We had crafted something extraordinary. As I stood at the front delivering the pitch, I glanced at Daniel. He wasn't smirking, he wasn't rolling his eyes. He was focused, engaged, and when it was his turn to speak, he delivered with conviction. The clients were impressed. We secured the contract, and the entire company celebrated. That victory wasn't just about numbers or revenue. For me, it was proof that growth and change were possible, not just for myself. But even for someone like Daniel, after the celebration, Daniel approached me in the hallway. He didn't joke, didn't smirk. He simply said, "You did good, dude." Was short, simple, but heavy with meaning. And for once, I didn't sense sarcasm behind his words. In that moment, I realized that my greatest revenge hadn't been humiliating him or proving him wrong. It had been turning an enemy into someone who could finally see me for who I truly was. But life doesn't pause after one victory. The corporate world kept moving, and soon I was offered a new challenge, a promotion that would take me beyond managing a single department. I would be overseeing multiple branches, shaping company-wide strategy. It was everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed for. As I packed up my office to move to the executive floor, I looked around at the space where so much had changed for me. This room had been the stage for my revenge, my growth, my transformation. And now, it was time to leave it behind. before I left. I wrote a simple note on the whiteboard. Respect is the foundation of success, because that was the lesson I had learned through all the pain and all the triumph. Respect for yourself, for others. Even for those who once tried to break, you was the only way to truly rise. Moving to the executive floor felt surreal. The office was bigger, the view wider, and the responsibilities heavier. But what struck me most wasn't the luxury, it was the weight of the journey that had brought me there. Every insult, every smirk, every sleepless night had led to this moment. I wasn't just climbing the corporate ladder, I was rewriting the story of who I was. The first few weeks in the new role were overwhelming. Meetings with directors, strategy, sessions with the board, endless decisions that impacted hundreds of employees. But I leaned on everything I had learned: discipline, resilience, empathy. I listened more than I spoke, but when I did speak, I made sure my words carried clarity and conviction. Slowly, I carved my place at the table, not as an outsider, but as a leader. What surprised me most, however, was how often my thoughts drifted back to Daniel. Not with anger, but with a kind of strange gratitude. If he hadn't mocked me, would I have pushed myself this far? Would I have found the strength to grow beyond my insecurities? His cruelty had been the fire that forced me to forge steel out of weakness. One afternoon, while reviewing reports, I received a message from HR. Daniel had submitted an application for a transfer to another branch. My first reaction was curiosity. Was he running away from the shadow of our past, or was he trying to start fresh? Either way, I approved it without hesitation. Before he left, he stopped by my office. He stood at the doorway, not the cocky, smirking man I had once known, but someone quieter, more reflective. "I just wanted to say," he began, hesitating, "you turned out better than I ever thought you would. It'd be better than I ever could." For a moment I didn't know what to say. The years of bitterness between us couldn't be erased with one sentence, but there was sincerity in his voice that I had never heard before. "I didn't become better than you," I said softly. "I just became better than who I used to be." He nodded, almost relieved, and left. That was the last time I saw him in that office. His departure marked the end of an era, just for him, but for me. For years, my story had been tied to his shadow. He was the antagonist in my narrative, the fuel for my ambition. But now, as he moved on, I realized my journey was no longer about him. It was about the future I was building, the people I was leading, the legacy I wanted to leave in. The months that followed, I poured myself into shaping the company culture. I pushed for mentorship programs, fairness in promotions, and stronger anti-bullying policies. I didn't want another young employee to feel the way I had, powerless, silenced, humiliated. If I could create an environment where people thrived instead of suffered, then all my struggles would have meaning, and the results were undeniable. Employee satisfaction rose. Productivity improved. People began to talk about the company not just as a place to work, but as a place to grow. My name became synonymous with change, with progress, with leadership that put people first. But the most unexpected reward came years later. I was giving a keynote speech at a leadership conference, sharing my journey, not the polished version, but the raw truth. I spoke about the pain of being mocked, the nights of doubt, the resilience it took to rise. When I finished, the audience gave a standing ovation. Afterward, a young professional approached me, eyes shining with hope. "I've been dealing with a bully at work," she said quietly. "I thought about quitting, but hearing your story makes me think maybe I can fight through it too." In that moment, I realized my story had grown beyond me. It wasn't just about my revenge or my rise. It was about giving others the courage to believe in their own strength. Because at the heart of it, revenge hadn't been about crushing my bully, it had been about refusing to be crushed myself. Looking back now, I don't feel anger toward Daniel. I don't even feel triumph over him. What I feel is gratitude for the journey. Gratitude for the pain that became fuel, for the humiliation that became a lesson, for the obstacles that became stepping stones. Life has a way of testing us in ways we never expect. Sometimes it comes in the form of hardship, sometimes in the form of people who try to break us. But if we endure, if we refuse to give up, those very struggles can become the foundation of our greatest strength. I started as the quiet new hire with an old briefcase and trembling hands. I became the target of ridicule, the butt of every joke. But I refused to let that be the end of my story. I rose, step by step, fueled by determination, resilience, and an unshakable belief that I was meant for more. And in the end, I didn't. Just rise above the bully, became the kind of leader who could make sure no one else would have to suffer the same way. That, to me, was the greatest victory of all.